All right. What's up, YouTube? Nick here. Today I want to talk about my conception of God and how I come to believe in God. And yeah, so I think this is one of the most common questions that I get asked, actually, is do you believe in some kind of, supernatural controlling power that is God that kind of dictates the choices that you make in life? Something like this. And I would say probably not, although kind of. And so what I would say is this, is it starts from the fact that you make choices, all right? Because you make choices in the world, what this means is that you have some value hierarchy that dictates your choices. And then I think this is just true of everyone. And your choices aren't random. And so what that means is that there's some set of principles that guides the choices that you make. And then I would say, for all intents and purposes, what sits at the top of the hierarchy that dictates the choices that you make is God. And okay, so if you watch any of Jordan Peterson, you know that this take is heavily inspired by Jordan Peterson. And I'd say it also, I want to give credit where credit is due. It's also inspired by Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke and also Bishop Barron. I'll put a link in a video. I'll put a link to this video in the description below of the four of them actually talking. Really a inspiring video that I, took a lot away from. But all right, so now you have this hierarchy of values that kind of dictates the actions that you take. And sitting at the top of that hierarchy is some highest value. And what I would say is, this is automatically true of all people, right? Because you don't make option, you don't make random choices. You make ordered, decided choices. Now, you might not know what your value hierarchy is fully, but there is a value hierarchy that dictates the choices that you make. And whatever sits at the top of that value hierarchy, for all intents and purposes, is God. And then you can actually form a relationship with this, what sits at the top of your hierarchy. Like if you have a question that you're facing in life that you don't know the answer to, and then you ask a question like, oh, what should I do in this situation? And then an answer comes to you, you can ask, where did that answer come from? Right? Because it didn't come from you, because you didn't know the answer to it. Right? And when I say you, I was actually talking to my buddy about this the other day. And you could argue that your conception of you is off, and look, fair enough. Maybe it's that your conception of you is off, and if you were fully aware of all that is you, then you would know the answer to these things. You know where this is coming from. But then, what I want to say is that this religious language, it's phenomenological, right? So, like, there's an experience you have that there's something outside of your control that guides your actions that you're not fully aware of. But you can form a relationship with it, and you can ask questions to it, and it will respond, and it'll give you answers. So it's like, okay, maybe it's you, maybe it's God, maybe it's this external being, whatever. Like, it almost doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter. Who cares? Like, phenomenologically, you have this experience that something guides your decisions, and, you can form a relationship with it. So we, just call that God. In some sense, it doesn't matter where it comes from. The fact is that you have this experience. All right, so then the connection between this and, I would say, a traditional view of God is that you have a personal God at this level. You have a personal God that everybody has, that you have. It's the personification of the highest value in the value hierarchy that dictates the actions that you take. All right, good. So, but now, in principle, you can swap out these hierarchies, these value hierarchies that dictate the actions that you take, right? So given that fact, you can ask, what should my value hierarchy be? And so that's an interesting question, because maybe your highest value is something like profit, right? And then this is something like, like now you're worshiping the capitalist God by, placing that as your highest value. And you could do that, right? But, do we want to do that? That's a good question. So then, but you can say that there's a highest value. There's a greatest good that I should orient my life around. And that greatest good is the, what, in my conception, because I don't believe in just one God. I believe that, for every value hierarchy corresponds a God. But then you could say, okay, there's a greatest God. And so I would call this something like the divine God or the divine logos. And that's, in some sense, it's like the greatest good to orient your life around. And I think this is equivalent to kind of the traditional religious definitions of God. And it's, it's the greatest good. All right, so good. So this is one way to get at God, but I think there's actually multiple ways to get at God, right? Because then there's also God the Creator. And then I also want to talk about one other conception, which is more of like an emergent God. And I do think they're actually all related, because all I've talked about at this point is just a personal God. But then you can have a collective God, right? And in some sense, it's something like, okay, you sitting in your own personal hierarchy, you have a highest value, right? But now if other people have the same highest value and you guys act together in some kind of, unison form, somehow you get this collective emergent being that comes from that. So an example of this, in our political landscape, you can take either an example on the left or the right. You can take, on the left, you got something like Antifa, and on the right, you got something like the Proud Boys. And what you have here is you have this collective movement that binds people together behind some kind of unifying principle, right? And so what's interesting, though, is that you get this kind of this emergent being defined by some set of principles, right? And so maybe on the left, it's, let's say, like diversity and inclusion is kind of the principle that's binding us together, or, something like this, right? And then you have this collective God, and it's more powerful and it's greater than even the individuals that live in it. And so if this sounds weird to you, like what I'm articulating is actually a superorganism. And so what it is a bunch of humans together acting in unison actually animates kind of a figure that's above them. Okay, so another way to look at this is you as a human being, you're actually made up of cells, right? And then the cells are full-fledged living organisms, I believe by the mitochondria or something. They're considered full-fledged living organisms. But when I look at you, I don't see cells. I see a human being, right? And so even though you are a human being, you're a full-fledged living organism on your own, you're comprised of cells which are full-fledged living organisms on their own, right? So if you were a cell and your conscious experience is at the level of a cell, then in some sense you might not be aware of the fact that there's a superorganism, the human, that by you living and acting out, you're animating, and your actions are actually keeping this superorganism of a human alive. And in the same sense, I could say if you have a bunch of humans acting together, acting out a particular set of principles, you're actually animating a god. You're animating a superorganism that's a god. So it's in the same sense that cells make up you make up this god. And in this format, though, it's a polytheistic conception, like it's a polytheistic cosmology in some sense that I'm describing here. All right, good. So now, as you act, there's a collective God that's actually being animated, that I would say, right? And so what I'm describing here is a phenomenology. I want that to be clear. What I mean by that is it's like I think I'm articulating experiences that are just things that we experience, and then I'm just putting some description to it. I'm not trying to make some kind of universal truth claim. I'm trying to give a descriptive, it's just a description to things that, we observe. All right, so you have this God, and then what I would say, and maybe you guys noticed this, I would say the 2020 election, I remember there was something in the air leading up to that election, and it felt like we were in mass psychosis, and it was like, I don't know, I just remember turning on the news, and if you look on the left, it's just like, like on the right, we got the Proud Boys, and they're armed, and we've got a militia, and they're gonna come, destroy everything. And if you look on the right, they're talking about the left and talking about, the protests and talking about Antifa and all this other stuff. And it just seemed like we were on the verge of a complete, just like, civil war. I don't know. Like, it was a very unusual time. And what I would say, actually, what's kind of going on there is that in this framework is that you have two gods that are fighting it out in some sense. And they're fighting it out through humans, right? So you have, let's say, the Antifa god is you have a bunch of people described by Antifa that, they unify together with the same common goals, and they animate the superorganism, right? And that's, for all intents and purposes, that's a god. And then on the right, you had the same thing with, say, the Proud Boys, unified by a different set of principles, and then there was a clash between these two gods, right? And it wasn't, we're all worshiping the same god. It's, this group is worshiping one god, and this group's worshiping another god, and then there's a fight between the fact that we're worshiping different gods. And I think that this is, technically speaking, right, in this phenomenological description, that is what was going on in the 2020 election, right? And then what you can ask, though, is there a God that we can worship collectively that can bind all of us together? And in some sense, I would say that that's the divine God. Like, that's, and if someone is describing to you a description of the divine God, and your thought process is, fuck that shit, I don't want to get behind that, then what they're describing cannot be the divine God, right? So I want to put that out there, because it needs to be, the divine God is some sense, it's the values and principles that binds all of us together. So if it's not binding you together by some description someone's making about what this divine God is, then what they're describing is not the divine God. Might be close to it, might be a God that's close to it, because I think you can have a ranking of better and worse gods. Right? And I don't want to get too into the weeds unless someone's interested by that. I'm just going to assume that, you were on board with saying that there's some way to distinguish better and worse things. Like I would say, the God of Nazism is probably bad, and then the God of, love and compassion and truth is probably pretty good, But, all right, so then I hope this is two kind of, well, they're kind of the same thing. I mean, you have this personal God, but then you have this collective God that's binding us together. And, then you could say, okay, Nick, like, I'm on board with you, but that's not quite the religious conception of God that I'm used to. And I actually think it is. Right? Because it's a personification of this value hierarchy, right? Now, if you personify that, you could ask, like this God that I described to you is eternal, right? If you're acting in these principles along with a bunch of other people and you die, the God lives on because the God's beyond any one person. And it's so long as people prescribe to a certain set of values, their actions are animating this God, the super being, right? And so this God's eternal. You can commune with this God by asking questions, and then your principal value hierarchy will somehow bubble up an answer. But where does that come from, right? Ask a question that you don't know the answer to, and then watch an answer come to you, and it's like, well, where did that come from? And phenomenologically, like, it doesn't matter where it actually came from. What I'm saying is the experience, phenomenologically, there's something beyond you, beyond what you're aware of, that gave you an answer to the question you're looking at, and that's God answering your prayers. I mean, phenomenologically, that's just what it is. I mean, you don't have to believe in supernatural, strange beings. And one thing I want to hammer home, if you have a conception of God or these religious ideas that you think are ridiculous, then, I humbly ask you to maybe consider that you're wrong, right? Your conception is off. Your conception is wrong. Like, if your conception is these terms that millions of people over thousands of years have believed in are ridiculous, like, what's more likely, that you're wrong or all of human history, right? I mean, all right, I'm just going to leave it at that. All right, and there's one thing, and this is a bit beyond what I've fully fleshed out, so, be nice to me if you disagree. I mean, I'm happy to, if you do disagree, great, like, tell me about it, but, so there's one other key element that these traditional religions, like, Christianity and Islam and Judaism, is this idea of God that I'm describing is also the creator. All right. And so there's a link that I made. And so this, I haven't fully fleshed this one out, but it's something like this. This divine logos that I'm describing to you is the personification of the highest value. It's the greatest good, right? So if you take that and then you have to accept this on faith, that being itself is good, that existence is good, well then what created this, right? Something like breathed this into existence. But if being itself is good, right, and then we can, act out and personify the greatest good, and that's got to be symbolized by, this divine God, then whatever created existence to give rise to this greatest good must also be the greatest good. And so it's, this is one way that you can make an association between the the creator and the greatest good, but you do, I would love to hear anybody else that can form a connection between these two, between, this greatest good description of God and then the creator description of God, because it's not obvious to me that they should be equivalent. But I think what I laid out there, it's a somewhat convincing argument. I mean, to me, it's somewhat like, okay, that smells like it's somehow in the right direction of some valid description of why, it might actually be the case that these two are kind of the same God in some sense, and yeah, so hopefully this kind of fleshes out my notion of God. I don't, in some sense, I think that, if you are, let's say, a skeptic to religion and you're kind of atheist, I agree with you. Like, I think you can come up with, a dumb enough conception of God that I would also reject it, right? But what I, ask is maybe consider if your conception of God is easily rejectable. Maybe your conception of God is wrong, right? And I just want to drive that point home. And maybe it's, there's something to these traditional religions that you're missing. And that maybe, there's something of value that you're missing. And, maybe I'd recommend trying to have an open mind to this and seeing that, millions of people over thousands of years have valued this and have adopted this worldview. And maybe there's actually something to that. So yeah, I'll end on that. If you like the content here, make sure you like and subscribe to stay up to date. And yeah, and until next time, take care.